This morning. We're pleased to have Dr. David Langston, one of our extension plant pathologists and the director of the Tidewater AREC. We're also joined by Dr. David Holzhauser, one of our extension agronomists that deals heavily with soybean production here in Virginia. So we're pleased to have both of those gentlemen with us this morning. One of our topics for discussion this morning is going to be disease management and some of the in-season management of those diseases, particularly in soybeans. We may touch a little bit on some corn topics, but I think most of the discussion this morning is kind of going to be geared towards soybean production. But if you have corn-related questions, between all of us, we'll try to do the best we can to address those. But thank you for joining us this morning. Just one quick housekeeping item before we get started. If you just hold your questions to the end of the presentation, hopefully that'll help the flow of things and we won't have any interruptions or anything. So if you have a question during the presentation, if you have the ability to put that in the chat box, we'll address those as they come in at the end of the presentation. But we'll give everyone a chance at the end. We'll unmute everybody and hopefully facilitate a little discussion and get some questions answered and hopefully have a great topic today. So without further ado, Dr. Langston, thank you for joining us this morning, and we'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Deb. Robbie, the screen share here says only one participant can share at a time, so you might have to. There you go. Good morning, everybody. It's still saying it. I'm having a hard time sharing my screen.
David, I switched the option there, so maybe you should be able to now.
Yeah, I'm hitting. All right, give me a minute.
We've got it now, David. We can see your screen.
Okay. All right. Good morning, everybody. I'm the stand-in soybean pathologist since Dr. Mellors left. I've talked to her, and I've got a few things that she thinks would be good to, she thought would be good to cover. Hopefully, we'll be able to answer a lot of questions, or at least give you an update on what we think is important. I'm going to leave these first two slides, David, if you would, mostly cover the growth stages and maturity. If you want to cover these.
Yeah, let me just mention this to begin with. I think what we're doing now is our full season beans may be starting to flower right now. A photograph was sent to me by a farmer in Madison County of some beans he planted in April. I think he sent it last week, and those were already starting to flower. Now, he's growing an early maturity group. So we did some work years ago with our variety test, just monitoring development. So once we start planning for foliar fungicide applications, or the possibility for one, you may want to know about when those soybean are going to be at the R3 stage. Now, the R3 stage is, of course, and David, you have some photographs of that. Let's go through those. I thought I sent you some photographs of the R3 stage. Is that in your slide set someplace?
I've got them down a little bit later in the presentation. I moved
it back
fine,
to. But just let me say that R3 stage is when those first pods are starting to form. So this data that I'm showing, now for those of you that can't see it, I'll try to describe it. If you take a group 4 soybean, whether they're in the early, mid, or late 4, and you plant those in early May, those things will be flowering by the end of the month. And they will begin forming pods by, the first 2 weeks of July. So those are your critical times for fungicide applications, for foliar fungicide applications. Let's move to the next slide, David. You move to group 5s, it's going to be about, 10 days later. Yeah, there's the group 5s. Early 5s, if you plant those in early May, they won't start flowering until the first, probably the second, third week of July. And the pod set will begin in late July and August. So that's what you're looking at here as far as application timings for foliar fungicide. So David, I'll turn it back over to you.
Okay, David, and I might seek your input a couple of times through the presentation. When we talk about what we saw last year with soybean diseases, this is a slide that Dr. Miller has used. It seemed like we typically get a whole lot of stem and root disease samples compared to some of the other ones. We typically don't get as many foliar disease samples as we do some of the stem and root diseases, probably because you can look and see spots, and you know it's one of these leaf spot pathogens. You might not be as apt to send one in because you can see what's causing the damage. With stem and root diseases, you never really know what's causing the damage because it's down below. A lot of times we have to biopsy it and plate it out. So and we see a lot of these throughout the season, especially later in the season, we'll see some of these. With nematodes, typically, and I'll cover nematodes in a minute, is usually when we see the poor growth and spots in the field that seem to be having some problems. We also see abiotic problems from time to time, and when we get an insect, when we suspect insect injury, we typically send those to Dr. Sally Taylor. Every pathogen has got some type of environmental condition that favors it to be able to infect the host. And the main ones that we see in Virginia are your frog eye leaf spot, your Cercospora leaf blight, and brown spot. They're all fungi. The first two are both in the same genus. Typically, their optimum temperatures are in the 77 to 86 degree Fahrenheit range. The brown spot's got a wider range, and we don't normally see that as much as we see the first two. If we're trying to plan a spray, we're planning on spraying 4 frog eye and Cercospora and not anything else. And we hope that what we apply is going to also cover some of the other fungal foliar diseases that you might see. Just about any disease, especially a foliar disease, it relies on humidity and leaf wetness and the duration of that leaf wetness period. So if you've got several days in a row of extended periods of leaf wetness, and it's been pretty humid, and when I take the dog out in the morning, I get wet. The dog gets wet. It's pretty. There's a lot of leaf wetness early in the morning, and if we don't have any rain, it burns off. But those extended periods of leaf wetness and high humidity really contribute a lot to disease progress. So that's what you got to watch out for. That and as you well know, the seasonal rains. This goes into what David was talking about. When we talk about spraying fungicides, and we basically spray fungicides based on three different things. We typically pick one and kind of go with it. What is shown here is when we spray soybeans at a certain growth stage, something that you can look at and determine, and then you say, okay, we're at R3 or R4, it's time to spray, maybe a late R2 stage. But the critical time, the fungicide spray window that Dr. Mel talks about for spraying fungicide is the R3 and R5 stages, or somewhere in that range of time to spray. This is the screen, this is the shot that David talked about. I just pulled out the R3 picture, David. I didn't include the other pictures. And if you want to comment on what you're looking at here, what you're looking for, please go ahead.
Yeah, one thing about the R3 stage, in many cases, we're pulling the trigger too early on these fungicides. We'll see full bloom, and that's really a little early for this. These fungicides will only last so long. So we found that if you wait until you start seeing very small pods at the top, one of the top 4 nodes of the plant, that's the time you need to start pulling the trigger. Now, we have seen results going on into R4 stage, and that's the larger pods at the top of the plant. But rarely do we see it once seeds start forming. We're just applying the product too late then. But I just caution you, try not to go in too early. You'll run out of product, and don't go in too late, because then it's really too late to do anything about it. Now, keep in mind on this R3 plant, if it's an indeterminate plant, which generally are group 4s, you're going to have some fairly large pods at the bottom. But don't base this on the pods at the bottom. Go to the top 4 nodes and base your timing on that.
Very good. Thank you, David. Dr. Mill and I think David and I've been in an email string about a soybean risk advisory for your Cercospora diseases. And this is something that Dr. Mill has put out on the Ag Pest and Crop Advisory, where she has different locations located across the state, and she gives you a soybean disease risk based on the environmental conditions, whether or not to spray. Certainly, it's not just the temperature, it's also the growth stage. So there's 2 things you got to take into account here. So if you fall in that growth stage range and you're in one of these high risk counties, it's probably a good idea to go ahead and spray. The thing about this model, this advisory system, is that it's usually better at telling us when not to spray. It's correct more than 90% of the time on when not to. And that's about 70% accurate in telling you when to spray and giving you that action, that trigger. So, so I think it's a good, to me, telling you when not to spray is just as important, or it's sometimes even more important as telling you when to spray. Once again, you got to keep this in mind when, with your growth stages of the plant. This is based on weather primarily.
David, could I jump in here for a minute?
Yep.
We were planning on developing an phone app and a website for this, but we needed some funding to do that. Virginia Soybean Board decided not to fund the project, just largely because Dr. Mel had moved to USDA in Arizona and she would not be here today. But one thing I noticed last year with these forecasts, I saw a lot of people spraying in the moderate when we were saying it's moderate, and I don't like the word scout. I would say hold. That'd be my terminology to use for that, because quite honestly, unless it's frog eye leaf spot, you can't scout for many of these foliar diseases. But I caution you, only if it's in that high level do those percentages work. And that's very important. The 70% of the time, I think that's being pretty liberal about that. I think it's closer to maybe 50 to 60% of the time we can tell you to spray or not, and we're correct. So that's not that great, but on average, we only get a response to foliar fungicide about 1/3 of the time on soybean. Okay, David.
Yep. Thank you, David. And I'm going to circle back to one thing I meant to say earlier. Was, that I mentioned there's 3 ways we typically spray fungicides. We spray fungicides according to a growth stage or a days after planting. I think the growth stage, especially in this case, is better than a days after planting spray. We spray them according to scouting, which I don't like, because you're reacting to what you see and it's not preventive. You've got to catch that disease very early in the epidemic for that fungicide spray to be good. All fungicides work better when sprayed preventively. Trying to spray a fungicide after disease is already moving across the field. Typically fungicides don't perform very well. You put more stress on the fungicides for resistance development. There's a lot of problems with that. So we typically like to use an advisory, which is the 3rd way. They'll kind of use biology of the organism and the phenology of the plant to help us time a fungicide spray. Timing is probably, as you know, timing is probably one of the most critical factors in getting any pesticide to work correctly. And fungicides, it's probably even more so. So looking at some of the fungicides, there's a bunch of fungicides, and I apologize for some of these things not lining up quite as well. My one computer, format's a little bit different than another. we really have three basic chemistries we're looking at here. We're looking at sterol inhibitors, which are your DMIs, your QOIs, which are your strobilurin fungicides, and your SDHIs, which are your group 7 fungicides. Those are all very specific systemic fungicides. We don't have any, and they mix them together to get you kind of a multi-site component to a spray. And it also broadens the spectrum of control a little bit. But you can look here that sometimes some standalones are just about as good as some of the mixes. I will say that we've seen a good bit of resistance with some of the QOI fungicides, not just in Virginia, but across the Southeast. DMI is not quite as much. We really haven't seen a lot of problems with the SDHIs because they're kind of new to the scene. We haven't seen, but most of the time when you see a SDHI or a QOI, it's going to be mixed with something else. DMIs are typically your only standalones. Your Domark is typically a widely used fungicide in that regard. Lucento is a little bit different. It's a DMI and an SDHI, so that's kind of a little bit different compared to some of the rest of them as a two-way split. You've got a lot of DMI and QOIs. That's been the way to go for a long time, and they all seem to perform, fairly well. There's just a lot of choices out there. Basically, what I do is I think about this efficacy chart, and I think about the price of the product. And then you think about the price of soybeans, and you make a decision based on that. Certainly, you don't want to spend money on something that's not efficacious. You don't want to, especially if it's not gonna pay off. So it's a decision. This is a decision the growers have to make, and a lot of it has to do with price. So these are some results from Dr. Mills' trial last year, looking at a few different fungicides, 3 application timings. When you look at foliar disease severity, yeah, it looks like for the most part that the earlier sprays typically perform fairly well with reducing the amount of foliar disease present. Your later R5 spray doesn't do as good a job, but when you combine R3 and R5, which would be intuitive, you get better control. Your premixes down here seem to be doing real well in Dr. Mills' trial. Preaxor plus Domark, Quadris Top, and Miravis Top all seem to be performing really well. But when you look at yield, you get a little bit different response. Some of your lower yields of when you sprayed at R3, your higher yields typically, at least in this chart, are with your R5 spray or your combination. Your combination is always gonna do better, but once again, it's a more expensive proposition. It depends on how much you think you're gonna make on those soybeans. With seed quality, we don't always see a great response with seed quality. Typically what we see here, once again, some of the premixes are doing really well when sprayed later or sprayed twice. The R3 not as much set with Miravis Top. Once again, this data is to help you make that decision if seed quality has been an issue with growers in your area.
Yeah, David, if I could jump in there. One thing you got to recognize is the earlier application is going to be generally is better for a yield response because then we're protecting that leaf area, which is so valuable. But that's going to play out by the time we start forming seed, and that's generally why those later applications or the early plus a late applications can sometimes give you a better seed quality. But I'll emphasize what David said. Just because you're controlling the disease doesn't mean you're going to help with seed quality.
This is a summary of some of the products that she tested. Your Maravus Top seems to cover a lot of bases, but you need to check the price on that product. Most of them don't perform really well on seed quality. I mean, normally when we look at a table like this, there's E's in it for excellent. We don't see these anywhere here. Once again, these are all premixes except for the Domark product. The Domark is a standalone, which means it probably might have a different, a lower price point. But a lot of your premixes do tend to cover a lot of bases pretty well, especially the new Maravus Top's got a little bit different chemistry in it. I would compare that with something like the Lucento, which is a SDI and a DMI combination. So fungicide recommendations for soybeans, I've already covered a lot of this. Foliar fungicides probably won't work, won't make money if it's really dry. If it's super dry, probably use the Scout and mainly use the weather-based Decision Aid. Apply fungicides near 3 R3. Strobilurin resistant pathogens, these are your group 11 fungicides. Don't rely on strobilurin only product, but we don't normally see a lot of those used in soybean. It really, if you got a strobilurin product, it needs to be mixed with something else to be able to use it. Domark is generally effective and inexpensive. Among the premium products, Quadris Top SBX is what Dr. Mel has recommended. And typically fungicides don't prevent seed quality issues, so you can't rely on them for that. Just some pictures and thoughts about some of the soil-borne diseases. You've got sudden death syndrome characterized by vascular discoloration in the lower stem, the main stem of the plant. One thing that does stand out is the interveinal chlorosis and necrosis of the leaves. You got fusarium stem and root rot, vascular discoloration, and basically a dead plant. Stem canker, where you've got cankers, brown cankers that are on the stem up and down, that run the length of the stem. Charcoal rot, I don't know how much of this we see. Typically, when I used to see charcoal rot in snap beans, it was during really hot weather. We used to call it ashy stem blight. Go ahead.
That's the case for soybean too. It'll be generally during a drought when very other diseases are showing up. But if you start seeing something and haven't had rain for a while, cut that stem. It's very characteristic. You can, or I guess, just scrape the outside of the stem. Is that correct, David?
Yep. And you see all those little black dots or the fruiting bodies of the fungus. Very good diagnostic. Anthracnose usually hits the stems. You see it here default, it's causing death to the leaves, but if you look below those leaves, you'll typically find a lesion. They run the length of the lesion. I think some samples came in last year with anthracnose. And then your phomopod and stem blight here. Not a lot of times as a fungicide, you can't really react to these things. You need to make a note of it, know you have it, but you can't react to them very well. The biggest thing that you can do with these types of diseases is rotate. But a fungicide application is not going to help you with these particular problems. Quickly on nematodes, we typically when we see a nematode problem, it looks like something else, either a misapplication or overlap or lack of overlap or lack of coverage. It looks like a fertilizer problem. You see these patches in the field that are stunted. You look at the roots. A lot of times the roots will be have reduced growth, or you'll see galling on the roots, or in the case of soybean cyst, you can actually see the white females directly on the outside of the root when you pull them up. But you really got to dig these up, not so much pull them up. I'd prefer to take a small shovel and dig it up and then shake the root out to be able to see the symptoms good. I think this is my last slide, which y'all will be glad to hear. For nematodes, sampling and thresholds is the key. You've got to take samples. A diagnostic assay is only good for what's causing the problem, right? It's something, why are my plants looking bad? And that's what a diagnostic assay is for. It's not for nematodes. you control those well before at planting or before you plant. So it basically helps you determine what's the problem in that spot. So what I typically do, if I've got a bad spot and if I dig up a few plants and can't see evidence of root gone or root damage, I'll send in a fertility sample and a nematode sample. And generally when we do the fertility sample, sometimes we'll take a sample from a good area where the growth is normal and the symptomatic area. For predictive assays, this is where we sample all the fields at one time in the fall. What we're looking at there is we got an idea of what we want to plant next year. We want to see if we've got any nematode populations that reach the threshold levels that we need to treat, something that'll pay for itself against some of these nematodes, or if you need to use a resistant variety. Usually we want to take these samples when it's still warm outside, right at the end of the season, end of the growing season, somewhere close to harvest, when those nematode populations are still high. That's going to be your most accurate assay as far as thresholds are concerned. And with that, I'm gonna wrap it up. I've got my contact information here. I think a lot of you might have Dr. Holzhauser's contact information. If you have any questions, I'll be happy to try to answer them, or if I can't answer them, maybe Dr. Holzhauser can.
David, I'd like to lead off with a question. You mentioned you mentioned earlier that most of the fungicides are systemic. Now, could you better define systemic? In other words, could you spray it and only get coverage at the top of the plant, and will that fungicide travel down the stem and move into those leaves below the plant? Of course, those lower leaves in many cases are the ones that we're going to need the disease control on.
Well, most of those fungicides are systemically or either locally systemic, or they exhibit a croppedal movement. They move from an area that's lower up to the top of the plant. So you're mostly getting the fungicide up in the top portion of the plant or on the leaves that you actually hit. So coverage is probably is going to be a thing you need to think about. You want to make sure that you can get some of that fungicide to penetrate down into that canopy to be able to get coverage. But most all these fungicides they exhibit a croppedal movement. They move from wherever they touch the plant up, whether it's on the stem or on the lateral stem or on the main stem.
Right. One reason I mentioned that's what I was thinking. They do move into the leaf, but they don't spread throughout the plant. Whenever we're spraying fungicides, it is critical, so critical to use these nozzles that'll give you those droplets that are categorized in the medium category. I think Bobby Grisso and I did work years and years ago on that. When we used these fine nozzles that stayed in the top of the canopy, didn't penetrate, but when we used what I call herbicide nozzles, the large droplets, and so they just blasted right through the canopy, and we got very little on really any of the leaves. So the nozzle selection is very important. High volumes, 15 gallons or more for this. So I just want to emphasize that coverage is key to fungicide effectiveness.
Flat fans typically penetrate better than your hollow cones.
That is correct, but I would stay away from the air inductions. Those droplets are just too big. We tend to blast it all the way through and don't get a good coverage with that.
Any questions? I see a couple of comments in the chat box here. It's publications.
Thank you, David. I was just going to mention that Shelley has provided the links there to the Ag Pest and Crop Advisory, as well as the publication that you mentioned on predicting soybean development and some of the efficacy data. So if you can see those links in the chat box, if you're joining us, that's where you can find some of those publications. So thank you, Dr. Holzhauser and Dr. Langston, for those comments this morning. Great presentation. I see we've got Dr. Wade Thomason on the line with us this morning. I just wanted to give Wade a chance, not really to put him on the spot, but if he wanted to make a few comments on in-season corn disease management, or if he's seeing anything from some of his plot work this year. Wade, any comments you'd like to make on that? Wade, I think I unmuted you, Wade, so you should be good. Sorry about that.
Yeah, can you hear me now?
Yes, sir. We've got you now.
Okay, good. Sorry about that. It was arguing with me. I don't have a lot to add. I really enjoyed the update there on the soybean side. It is time. We're silking and tasseling, so it is time for applications. I know of a few instances, especially in irrigated acres, where that would be a wise thing to do. I'm not seeing a lot of disease development in most places, though, due to the dry weather we've had in the last few weeks. So I think that's kind of where we stand.
I do know that some at-tassel applications have been made recently. I talked to a grower this week that had done a few.
Thanks, Wade. Appreciate you joining us this morning, providing those comments and updates. Any other questions for Wade or both Davids this morning? Great presentation. All right. Well, I guess we don't have any questions this morning. So again, thank you all for our guest speakers this morning, Dr. Langston, Dr. Holzhauser, and Dr. Thomason for joining us. Just a few comments I'd like to make. First thing you see on your screen there this morning, if you take just a few minutes and follow that link to provide us some feedback and evaluation on the program, future topics that you may like to see, or any feedback you'd like to provide us, we'd really appreciate that. It should take only a minute or two of your time to do that. So we request if you could please do that for us and help us out. It's also been posted in the chat box, a direct hyperlink, so you could click directly on that in the chat box. So thank you again for all of our specialists that joined us this morning. Thank you for everyone else that joined us. Next week, our topic on VC Ag Today on July 16th, next Thursday morning, we're going to be joined by some folks from VDAX, the Department of Agriculture and Consumer Services. We're going to have some updates on some of their programs, some of the pesticide updates, maybe some updates on recertification for applicators and all those sorts of topics. So if that's something that'll be beneficial to you, we encourage you to join us and help spread the word on that. Be next Thursday morning, same link at 9 a.m. here. So once again, just like to thank everybody. Appreciate all of your efforts. Just like to thank all the agents that make this possible. Mike Broadus, Stephanie Romelchek, and her summer intern, Skylar Swan. And then we've got Trent Jones and Laura Maxey-Nay and her summer intern, Shelly Underwood. And of course myself. So thank you again to everyone. We appreciate you joining us weekly for these updates, and hope everyone stays safe and has a great rest of their week. Thank you again, Dr. Langston and Holzhauser and Wade. Appreciate y'all being here.
Thank you, Robbie. Enjoyed it.
Very welcome. Thanks for doing this, Robbie.
Yes, sir. Thank y'all. And we will share these recordings for those of you that are still with us. This has been recorded, and you can find it there at that link where the recordings are. So we also have podcast versions on the Westmoreland Extension site that we can send out the links to that as well. So if you weren't able to join us in person or know someone that wasn't able to join us, please check out those recordings for this information. So thanks again to everyone, and we hope you all have a great rest of your day.